So I have some thoughts and ideas, as well as a bit of ranting, and I'd like to just share it out into the world. Perhaps you could even call it a Monster Hunter world. I like Monster Hunter a lot. I started with World, and it quickly became one of my favorite games of all time, even before Iceborne. I also went back and played a bit of Generations Ultimate, but didn't get as far into it, and I'm currently playing through Rise Sunbreak. I love the combat system and the different weapon types of Monster Hunter, and the monsters themselves can be very cool. The gameplay is very solid. However, I think what you actually get from those monsters can end up being a bit uninteresting from a build crafting point of view. As a quick unrelated note that wouldn't be enough to make a whole separate video on, it would be nice if higher ranked versions of monsters also gave you the lower ranked material, so you wouldn't need to be forced to do trivial content when getting new weapons in high rank or master rank. Just let me only do the master rank version because it's the most fun. Armor sets are mostly fun. Weakness exploit and critical boost being so massively important can occasionally be annoying since it's a given in pretty much every build, but other than that, I don't have many complaints. And even then, those two skills act as nice measures of progression. Really what I'm focusing on in this video are the weapons. I should also mention that I do not personally use ranged weapons that much, so what I'm going to say primarily applies to my experience and observations with melee weapon types. And like I said before, I am only now playing through Rise, and I have heard there's some cool weapon effects in Sunbreak, but this video will mainly be from the perspective of World leading into Wilds. I think weapon variety within a given weapon type, at least for most, if not all of them, is incredibly lacking. You have tons of choice, technically, but a massive majority of those options are basically worthless from a mechanical standpoint. Whatever you pick won't really change your gameplay, as all the weapons have the same moveset. So there is bound to be a weapon that does the exact same thing, except with higher damage numbers. And at that point, why wouldn't you choose the higher damage option? Of course, I do recognize that a weapon looking cooler than the rest is itself a plus. And sometimes it is fine to just not care and use something simply because you feel like it. But to me, someone who does care about the power and use case of different weapons, that is an incredibly unsatisfying outcome. I do not personally mind using a lower damage option, and sometimes actively seek them out in games, so long as something about my gameplay changes. If nothing about my gameplay or approach has changed, there is no reason for me to not use the higher damage option. The only time I have experienced this in World, however, opting for a less effective build, is my stupid sleep charge plate build. It's less effective than if I just build for maximum damage in a typical build, sure, but sleep wake-ups with an SAED is incredibly fun. The primary reason for this lack of variety, which shouldn't really come as a massive surprise, is that weapons within a type differ only in their damage characteristics, with the exception of Lunastra weapons, but we'll get back to those later. So you are able to find the weapon with the overall best combination of attack, sharpness, and affinity, and end up with a best in slot weapon fairly easily. Additionally, the implementation of elemental damage in Monster Hunter kinda sucks. You just go through the process I said before, best combination of attack, sharpness, and affinity. Just throw in the elemental damage you desire and you find the best in slot for any particular element. Combine that with an armor set that maxes out whatever elemental damage you're focusing on, and all choice has been removed once again. Since for a particular monster you'll just pick the corresponding element. And since elemental damage is better with quicker attacks, Dual Blades and Sword and Shield don't really allow you to play with elements and more just force you more heavily into them. With that out of the way, we can actually start talking about potential improvements to this system. The thing I would want the system to achieve is to be able to pick a weapon based on what it looks like, or maybe you just like the monster it came from, and then have it affect your gameplay in a way where it actually feels influenced by that monster's identity. So that even if it deals less damage than something else, as there will always be a meta option regardless, you feel much more connected to the weapon you chose. And even if you do pick it purely for its damage capability, that damage should be achieved in a more interesting way. The first thing I would propose is a general normalization of attack, sharpness, and affinity on weapons. Different monster weapons should still have their little quirks. Diablo's weapons having comparatively very high attack but worse sharpness and affinity, while Nargacuga and Odogaron weapons being essentially the opposite, having less attack but very good sharpness and affinity, etc. But just having those differences be smaller, or with more care put into them to make them end up with similar general weapon efficiency. From there, the weapons could focus much more heavily on additional effects outside of just base damage, while having a more balanced foundation to work off of. This brings us back to the Lunastra weapons I mentioned earlier as the simplest solution I could come up with to add more flavor to each weapon is by giving every weapon at endgame, and preferably at some point during progression as well, some kind of armor skill. For example, wouldn't it be really cool if equipping a max tier Nargacuga weapon gave you 3 points of evade window or extender? It would really give you the feeling of the evasive, mobile creature that Nargacuga is, while giving you a very enticing reason to pick that weapon specifically from a mechanical point of view. Additionally, switch skills don't seem to be making a return in Wilds, but tying such a concept to individual weapons within a type could be interesting. Like, most of the weapons' moveset would stay the same, but then your specific choice would grant you special moves that aren't available to something else. The different songs present on Haunting Horns, my favorite weapon type, basically achieves this concept, but I do not think it should be exclusive to that type. Different Gunlance shelling types also lean more in that direction, but I think it could go even further than that. Elemental damage is tricky because, as far as I see it, the whole system would basically need to be redesigned from the ground up to have a chance of being an interesting choice or system. I've never really enjoyed rock, paper, scissors elemental damage system, so I'm also biased in this regard. I am very iffy on elemental damage naturally not being affected by motion values in the same way as physical, as it just creates an imbalance that I don't think is that good. Either you make elemental damage so strong that every weapon type will want to use it anyway, at which point it makes more intuitive sense for the player to make it uniform with physical motion values, or it's something only a few of the weapon types really prize, which just makes you farm more stuff for those weapon types specifically compared to the rest. Also, monsters can apply elemental blights on players, yet we can't do so against the monsters. I think it would be cool if elemental damage, differing from the already existing abnormal status effects, could apply much shorter lasting, much quicker to build up status effects. For example, hitting a monster part a few times with a fire weapon could make that part burn for maybe 3 or 5 seconds, dealing some extra damage to that part, but not something that will tick down for a long time like poison, for instance. Ice weapons could occasionally apply a chilling debuff to the monster, making their next move slower, similar to the speed multiplier monsters get while exhausted. Water damage could also just deal exhaust damage to the monster, which would also mean KO if hitting the head, allowing for other weapons to KO monsters. Though of course less effectively than bludgeoning weapons, but you could also pick a water bludgeoning weapon to max out your KO damage. It would be like having exhaust files on a switch axe, but available to all weapon types. Truthfully, I don't know what electricity or dragon could do, but I'm sure they'd have something cool with them as well. I suppose dragon already has dragon seal, but like, nah. With these effects, elemental damage might not even need to be additional damage dealt to the monster with each attack, and instead just relying on these status effects to make each damage type valuable. Different monsters would still be more prone to each status effect. A fire-weak monster would be more easily set on fire, and thus would be easier to have higher uptime of that additional damage. But you could still use a fire weapon against a monster without an exceptional weakness and utilize the special effect. Though I'd say that slower weapons should have multipliers to this type of elemental status buildup, faster attacking weapons would still have the advantage for elemental effects specifically. On top of all this, I would also like to see more unique effects for certain weapons. I would want Rakidio's weapons to be the coolest blast weapons, not simply because they have the largest amount of blast buildup, and would actually advocate for having an equal amount with both Dodogama and Betelgeuse weapons, but rather because it does something interesting with the blast element, augments it in some way. Same with Rathian weapons and doing something cool with poison, perhaps making it deal its total damage in a shorter amount of time, or giving you some sort of buff while the monster is poisoned by you. Frostfang weapons dealing an instant amount of ice damage against the target instead of the chilling debuff as frostbite hits them. I don't know. This is all to say that the weapon you pick determines how you interact with the game's primary gameplay, fighting monsters. But I believe that that choice should not stop at the weapon type you pick. Two people could pick longsword, but also two different longswords for two different good reasons. One will probably end up doing some amount more damage than the other, someone always will, but they had unique gameplay experiences, right down to what specific item they chose enabled.